I don't really know if going to private school means that your kid is more likely to be quote unquote successful or like a better well-rounded human, or like, you know, yes, there's a lot of opportunity and stuff that comes from it, but arguably I look at my sister and Caroline did full public and I did the mix, and I'm like, yeah, Caroline's on paper like pretty well-rounded person and she's technically more on paper successful. So I'm like, does it really impact that?
Yeah,
you know. And it's funny,
there's so many factors that do, right? So
totally, it's like social circles, it's
as linear as
what
just
home life is like,
exactly,
you know, all that kind of stuff.
your overall temperament, you as an individual,
your
motivation,
values,
all that type of stuff. So
yeah.
And you can always change, and I think like you're a good example of that, where it's like you don't need to commit all or nothing, you know. And once you've, let's say you do start private school at year 9 and then that's not working for your child, like they can leave and go to public. They'll be, you know, or vice versa.
Exactly.
And I also, we have a friend at work who has also done that for her daughter, where she started intermediate private and actually didn't really like it and wasn't working, so moved back to public for the rest of senior. So
love that.
Yeah.
Welcome to It's No Secret, a podcast for Kiwis who want their money questions answered.
Ready, steady, go.
This podcast will answer the money questions you may or may not have on your mind. We'll talk to real Kiwis and share truths about our own financial lives,
both the successes and the failures. Because the truth is, there is no secret to achieving financial freedom.
Hello and welcome to It's No Secret. I'm Christine.
And I'm Kat.
And today we'll be chatting about whether private schools are worth, in air quotes, the investment. So today we'll look at both the cost to send your children to private versus public school and potentially weighing up some pros and cons of doing that. But before we get into it, just want to add a bit of a disclaimer that the school that you send your child to is very personal to you, your family, your financial situation, and ultimately the child. So this isn't us trying to impose our views. It's more just laying out some of the costs associated that we could find with these schools, and then naturally we'll probably spray in some of our opinions, but it's not to be taken as any sort of advice or direction.
Exactly.
Yeah, and I feel like, you know, Kat's probably closer to that decision-making point in terms of the fact that you have a kid, though. I mean, you're closer than me, but it's still not in the short term, right?
It's not in the short term. No. Lily's too.
Yes, she's got some growing to do.
Exactly.
But a great place to start is, what is the cost of sending a child to public versus private school?
Great question.
Do you want to kick us off with private schools?
Well, I think we'll talk a little bit about, I guess, the general cost and then get into some specific numbers. But for the purposes of this conversation, we've kind of kept it to like, it's called secondary school, right? I get really confused
9 to 13.
9 to 13. Get really confused with intermediate. It just throws me off all the time. We've kept it to kind of secondary school as the consideration point. And in terms of then private schooling, interestingly, the most expensive private school in terms of, I guess, core schooling costs in New Zealand is $33,000 a year. Of course, with public schools, there can be almost no cost or very, very like small cost. But when we're looking at the various costs between private and public school, private, we have to think of things like the actual tuition fees. So that makes up the core of whatever that kind of 33,000 or around about there amount will be. Fun fact that Christine found in her research was there's a fee before your child has even set foot in the door. So most private schools will have a non-refundable application fee, somewhere in the realm of like $200 to $350 based on kind of, we looked at some Auckland-based, Christchurch-based, Waikato, around the country schools. And then once your kid's accepted, there's also an acceptance fee, which can be somewhere between $1,100 and $2,500. Fun.
Yeah, that's when you get to actually walk on the school.
Yeah, I'm assuming that's just like an admin cost, but whatever. Like, cool, not really sure why they need to charge that, but here we are. Then, of course, you have to pay for uniform. You may need to make a contribution to like Old Student Society or a building levy. These are usually compulsory because they go towards maintaining school grounds. Some require a bond, which will be paid back once the student leaves. Some private schools, and I think also public schools, say like the grammar schools, offer discounts for like families with multiple children enrollment, or potentially discounts for early payment. And we also made the note that year 10 usually costs more in a private school landscape because students participate in some sort of outdoor education program that's usually kind of factored into that year's tuition. So they're all kind of the costs. And then I think the thing that's maybe we've not yet covered is like the peripheral costs around being involved in school sports and co-curricular activities and all that kind of stuff that often, you know, one child's uniform bill may be significantly higher than another if they're across like every sporting team and all that kind of stuff. And, you know, changing.
Depends on the sport as well. Yeah.
Changing their mind every year about what sport they want to do or whatever it is. So, you know, those costs can really become a lot more for certain families and kids.
Yeah, nice. Love it.
Yeah. By contrast, public schools. Yeah. So according to the Ministry of Education, there are 3 types of payments that can be factored into public schools. I actually didn't know this until we were talking about it, because I'm like, why not just call it a fee? Like, it's just a school fee. But anyway, the costs can either be called a donation, a purchase of goods and services, but it's kind of like a voluntary fee, and then also attendance dues. These are compulsory. So attendance dues are used by the school to pay for things such as like building works, and of course donations, although they sound optional, I believe are not.
I feel like it's kind of like an implied optional, and it's probably
is it actually a donation? Like, is it tax deductible?
No.
So it's a sham donation. They need a rebrand.
No. I remember when I was reading, it was very clearly not tax deductible. But I think, I mean, it's the equivalent to like tuition fee, but it's framed in a donation. And I think it is like ultimately optional if you're not in the financial position to contribute. Good. Yeah.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Sure. But so they're not going to like set the debt collectors after you kind of vibes if you haven't paid it, but also they're encouraging you to pay it.
Pretty much.
Okay, great. Yeah. Okay, cool. So they're kind of how the costs, I guess, could be captured. In terms of then public schooling in general, within the New Zealand Education and Training Act, every person who is not an international student is entitled to free enrolment and free education in any state school from the ages of 5 to 18. And schools can't charge for enrolment, attendance, or delivery of the curriculum. So that's obviously why they charge for things like donation.
Yes.
Don't just call it like an enrolment fee or curriculum fee, as I suggested.
It's optional, yeah.
Exactly. And so, of course, like there are some public schools that are pretty much free, and there are some public schools, grammar schools are technically public schools, right?
Yeah, they are. Yeah,
but they would they kind of fall into like the upper grey zone, which is sort of like a weird intermediate position between like pure public, entirely free, and private.
Yeah, it's funny you asked that, because when I was Googling it, I had to Google 3 times to be like, is Ipsum Grammar actually public? Because they don't have the wording on their website. I was like, am I being deceived here?
Yeah. Love that. So of course, you know, there can be some private public schools that basically have zero kind of cost or a very low donation cost. But then there would be some grammar schools that might have in the realm of like 500 to 750 were 2 in Auckland that we referenced, but then also up to about 11,000 a year from what we could see. So it does vary. We'll kind of dig into that. But Christine, how free is free? Because I mean, not everything is actually free. Yeah. It's not like you just get to send your kid on their way and never have a payment come out of your bank account, right?
Exactly. Yeah. So I mean, all of the fees that we've kind of talked about are directly linked to what the school charges per se. But there are, you know, there's a lot of stuff around that. So, you know, things like school trips, you know, outdoor education. That's why in a private school they add that later on. But it could be things like, I remember going away, or like a day at the zoo or something like that, where you know,
you need to pay for that.
Yeah, and you kind of don't want your kid to, you know, necessarily be left out or that kind of thing. There's obviously, as you said before, a bit of a spectrum with uniforms. So whether that's compulsory or not, you know, like your kid needs to wear clothes.
Yes.
And then there's stationery and classroom and kind of children's everyday school needs. And important point on that is also the increasing requirement for technology, which is becoming quite a big barrier to entry in a lot of ways. You know, a computer is not cheap. No. And if that's where the world's headed, there is an expectation that a kid has one. And then there's, of course, after school activities, which you kind of touched on. And then, I mean, you could get as granular as how far away is the school. So it's like petrol costs, you know, just pick up, you know, all that kind of stuff contributes to what is the overall cost to send my child to the school.
Yes.
So it's not as black as white as maybe you might think.
Exactly. It obviously is a cheaper option, but it's not necessarily entirely free.
Yeah, so, exactly.
Okay, cool. Yeah. So looking at them private schools, because I think, you know, they get a lot of like, well, positive and negative reviews, right? But we've done a bit of research across, as I mentioned earlier, some Auckland-based, Christchurch-based, and Waikato-based, various different like girls and boys
yeah.
schools. I'll let you dig into a few of the details, but the general range that we sort of found for 5 years of tuition was between $139,000 and $167,000. So this was, total tuition for 5 years, which comes out at about $27,000 to $33,000 a year.
Yeah. Yeah, nice.
Anything interesting, Christine, that you learnt in the time of you just researching up and down the country? Is there a particular hotspot that feels expensive?
Yes, Christ College in Christchurch.
Holy moly!
Yeah. Well, I mean, I was just in Christchurch for the weekend, and we drove past it, and I was like, "Wow, this looks like Harry Potter."
It's a beautiful building.
Yeah, I mean, it's very old school and beautiful, but I was like, must take a lot to maintain it. Yeah, but the thing that I found quite interesting was, I mean, we said this before, but the extra costs added to year 10. So for every one of these private schools, there was an increased amount for either year 9 and 10 or just year 10 for that kind of extra year. And then there's a campus. So I'll give you a run through of the general fees. Tuition, campus and building levy fee, which as we said was kind of ranging from anywhere from $500 to $1,300. And then there was also, I mean, there's boarding fees that we kept separate, but it's an additional if you were to send your kids away. There's like the old association or old girls and boys association fees. There's also potentially extra fees if you wanted to do things like international baccalaureate, which
instead of the standard
NCEA, or Cambridge or things like that. And then that's pretty much the bulk of it, really. But
decent monies.
Yeah, and when we got the kind of outcome of each of them, it was, so the most expensive school in New Zealand, private school, is Christ College, and then a close second was King's College, which is I'm not really surprised by, and then it was St Margaret's College in Christchurch. Well, of the ones that we looked at, and then St Peter's and Cambridge. Yeah. But then we left out, like Dio and St Cuths and a few other schools in Auckland that would probably be on par. But like, it's a lot of money.
Yes.
For 5 years of schooling.
It is.
And then to front that up on a yearly basis, when you boil that down to what that is on a monthly basis, I think it can range anywhere from $2,000 to $3,000 a month, which, is the current rent that Ollie and I pay. So it's a lot of money.
Well, we'll talk about that and how you would potentially afford it. Have I ever told you the story that I got told about the King's College announcement that had to go out to parents about sending their kids with money to...
No.
Oh my goodness. Oh. So I don't remember who told me this. So if they ever listen to the pod, please
Sorry
remind
in
me.
advance. Yeah.
It wasn't a parent from the school. It was someone that had heard it from a parent of the school. And I think it was towards the end of last year, they had to send out like a parent announcement, however they do that via an app or website, whatever they do, or an email. Yeah. Basically asking, could you please not send your kids to school with $100 bills to buy their lunch at the canteen because it's causing a problem for our staff. We don't have enough change to hand to like deal with notes of this size. And I was like, this is hilarious. Like this story just gives me so much enjoyment about like imagining these kids. Like firstly, who even has cash? Yeah. The only people that I know that even have cash to hand are like pilots. Yeah. I don't know, tradies.
Oh, after you get the allowance.
Who has cash? Yeah. And then secondly, who's taking out cash in $100 lots? Yeah. But hey, I guess it's like how the other half lives. So I'm not at all surprised that King's is up there in the top 2 most expensive.
Oh my goodness, I can't even imagine.
Yeah, exactly.
Wow.
Yeah, rich people problems.
I know, right?
So then I guess in comparison, how much is it going to cost us to go to, say, a public school? We've highlighted grammar schools, particularly in Auckland, because I guess we just know the most about those. Yeah. And also, given that grammar schools are at the upper end of expensiveness for a public school sector, we're kind of going to cover off those rather than necessarily like more regional or other schools, which I'm sure are a lot cheaper. But we looked at Epsom Girls Grammar, Auckland Grammar and Mount Albert Grammar, and the overall donation per year, as it were.
Yeah.
It was somewhere between $500 and $1,700 per student. So
Per year.
Yeah, per year. So Auckland Grammar being the highest at $1,700, Mount Albert Grammar Co-Ed being the lowest at $500, and they actually capped that it's $500 basically for your first kid, and then if you had other kids go to the school, it caps out pretty quickly. So the total cost per family caps out at like $680 a year.
Oh, nice.
So it's not sort of exponential as it would be if you were sending 3 children to a private school.
Yeah.
And Epsom Girls, they had a slightly different cost though, because you had also some numbers around what it would be if you were an international student. So talk to me about that, Christine.
Yes. So finding this information, as we said before, was quite hard. But when looking at what it actually costs to be an international student in New Zealand versus just a local day student, the cost for 4 terms sits around $20,000 for an international student at Epsom Girls Grammar.
Yep.
And then there's things like boarding or homestay costs, and then that actually the line items go out to also be what the cost of NCEA is, and then what the cost to sit scholarship NCEA exams are and things like that. But you made an interesting point off here before around like that's in kind of how Epsom Girls Grammar like values the cost of that education.
Yeah. And markets itself, right? And that's, I guess, the benefit to why people want to be in certain grammar zones is they have the perception that they're going to be accessing like an equivalent private school education for essentially a very, very, very
$1,000 a year.
minimal cost comparative to what you would be if you were actually going to a full private school.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, which I thought was quite interesting. And that comes back to the point of us like being like, oh, is Epsom Girls even private or public rather?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. So thoughts so far?
It's quite a gap between the two.
Yep.
But I mean, also kind of understandably so. I think, it's private for a reason, I guess. Yeah.
Yep.
But that doesn't take away from it just schooling generally having like a significant cost to it.
Definitely.
But I did also want to touch on this other piece of research that I found in the mix of the research was I think it's in either a school or an education body called ACG, and they run this education index. They did their most recent one was in 2018, and they found that a child born in 2018, the cost for their schooling year on year has been obviously increasing inflation from the year of 9 to 13. It kind of averaged at about $11,000 a year. So that was including everything from tuition fees to extracurricular activities to clothing, travel expenses, computer software and stuff. So all of those like fringe costs. And we are happy to share this document for those interested.
Yep. For the 5 years that we've been talking about, year 9 to 13, it would be 61,000.
Okay, yeah. Still not insignificant.
Exactly. Yeah. Not zero.
Yeah.
Different to zero. Okay.
Yeah.
So that kind of leads us on to like, well, how would you afford this? Because if you were thinking about these two options and being like, oh my God, what am I going to do? You probably need to start planning, or you need to get a really fantastically well-paid job. That's the TLDR, basically.
Start saving now.
Exactly.
So how are we going to afford this? Great question. We have looked at, across the 5 years, how much you would need for private schooling, either capitalised at the start of year 9, and then basically you're drawing down on that lump sum. So assumptions in this scenario team are you've got 11 years to save, i.e. from the day they're born. So you've been really organised and you're saving the minute they are born and you are investing that money because, of course, it's 11 years. It's a long-term horizon. You need some high growth funds working on your side.
Nice.
So we're assuming a rate of return of 7%. In order to have 155K, we've just taken like an average between kind of all the ranges that we talked about. 155K saved at the start of year 9, you would need to be putting aside $770 per month every month for 11 years.
Okay.
Yep.
I'm scared already. Yeah.
Yep. If you were to be affording Auckland Grammar, so at a 5-year cost of $8,500, also, just reminding everyone we've kept this purely to tuition. We haven't included extracurriculars and sports and all that other kind of stuff.
Yeah.
You would need to be saving $45 per month.
Sounds achievable.
Yeah. Lily right now is saving $20 a week into
nice.
her
Okay,
Be an
good.
Independent Baby account. So
She's on track.
She's on track to go to Auckland Grammar, which is concerning because she's a girl. But I think we could definitely work her
Branch out
towards,
to Epsom.
yeah, Epsom or Mags. So, yep, there is that. Now, of course, I'm going to just say that like not a lot of people, particularly in the private school front, have the ability to have A, that much forward thinking, and B, the cash flow to actually save for 11 years solid, particularly in a time where it's really expensive because you're dealing with like a baby and toddler and probably people being out of work and all that kind of stuff. And so my underlying assumption is that a lot of people are just going to work on the basis that they're going to have the cash flow when their kid hits year 9 and that they can just afford those school fees because otherwise I don't know how else they're paying for it. So if you were going to fund it from your cash flow once your child starts for private school of say $30,000 a year, you would need to be setting aside essentially $45,000 of your pre-tax income. So you can think of like whatever your household income is, $45K would be going off to education for one child. Now, per year, where that starts to make me feel really stressed is when you think about like 2 and 3 kid households and how quickly that can add up and therefore I guess what type of income you are locked into as a family and as 2 working adults in order to make that achievable. Also in a time where I'm going to assume that, you know, if you have a couple of kids, you need a house of reasonable size and you probably feasibly have a mortgage and you have other expenses and all that kind of stuff. So it's certainly more of a challenge from a cash flow point of view. Whereas if you were sending your child to say a grammar school and that was costing $1,700 a year, you'd be setting aside pre-tax income of about $2,500 a year, which is $220 odd a month. So you could think of it from the point of view of like, if I'm already spending $220 a month on like eating out or doing this, I could probably comfortably continue to fund that from cash flow.
Yeah, nice.
Yep. Fairly significant difference.
Definitely. Yeah.
Lots of pros and cons.
Yeah.
Shall we talk about the financial pros and cons first, Christine?
Yes.
What are you thinking?
Well, the financial con of having multiple kids going to a private school is that it's basically $150K salary alone.
Yep.
If it's
For say 3 children.
Yeah. If it's $45K of pre-tax income, it's a large amount of money.
It's a large amount of money.
Yeah.
And then I think it leads on to the point of like, what else are you then giving up or need to sacrifice as a family in order to do that? And I think that's A-okay. Like if you said, hey, you know, we are on a reasonable household income and yes, it's going to be very expensive to send all our kids to private school, but that's the number one thing that we as a family value, or we have children that we feel like are really going to benefit from being in a private school environment. And that's a, you know, sacrifice we're willing to make for 5 years. I would say 5 years, but if you have multiple kids, it'll end up being much longer because you probably don't have triplets. No. So that's probably going to drag out over a period of say 8 to 10 years, if not longer. And it's more that thing of, okay, well, what are the other things that you then want to do as a family, and do you have the financial resource to also do those things?
Yeah, and also like what else could you be doing that with that money to benefit the child and the future to become? Right? Yeah. In terms of like investing, or could you use that money to help them into their first home instead later on or something like that?
Or have like life experiences traveling or spending time in different parts of the world, all that type of stuff. Because, you know, I think there's also one of the trade-offs to private school is you potentially, you know, if you're paying for something, we have a tendency, like if we're paying a lot of money for something of high value, we want to get the most out of it. And so, you know, do you then have the flexibility to say, take your kid out of school for a couple of weeks to travel overseas to extend a holiday? You probably possibly don't want to do that. Maybe you do. So you know, all those types of little things.
There's also the pressure potentially that becomes for the kid. Because if you're the person making that investment, like, I mean, maybe not intentional, but what does that create in terms of like, well, you better get good grades, you know, that kind of thing?
Yeah. Particularly if it's putting the parents under financial pressure. I think maybe it's potentially a different story if it's like not something that's putting your family under any kind of financial pressure. But if it is, it's only human to start to think like, oh God, I really do want to like return on this investment. And I can absolutely see how that would play out inadvertently in real time, even if you were trying your hardest not to as a parent, and it would come across like we're all pretty easy to read people.
yes, definitely.
Okay, so there are a few cons. What about pros?
Just generally, unrelated to finance, or
just generally.
Yeah, I mean,
are there any pros related to finance?
Oh, for public schools?
Yes. Okay, cool. Maybe the pro is if you're in a specific area, you can access some really great grammar or public schools at essentially very, very low cost.
Yeah, exactly.
Awesome.
That's a good point. Yeah.
There is a caveat that you've possibly, particularly in relation to grammar zones, spent a ton more money on your house trying to get into that zone. So there is also that trade-off. But arguably, I was thinking about that with, say, the like amount that you need to put aside per month to save for private school, and how much, if you were in a grammar zone, extra you would potentially be paying on like a mortgage.
Rent.
Or rent. Exactly. But then if you did own the house and you had a higher mortgage, that ultimately works in your benefit. You know what I mean?
In terms of it being an asset.
Yes, exactly.
Not that your child isn't an asset, but you know.
But not all kids are going to pay themselves back.
Like, you'll cause more trouble than they will.
Literally, like they're still going to suck you through.
Are we speaking from experience? Maybe.
Yeah. So and look, and with children, there's a very long payback period. Like you're hoping that will pay off when they're adults, not when they're 18. So yes. Okay.
Yeah.
Non-monetary pros.
Yes, pros. Okay, so I mean, I feel like it can be very grey, because what we consider a pro might not be what you consider, and then it's two sides of the coins, and then, you know, all that kind of stuff. So, but a private pro, because I went to both a public and a private. I went to public Kirikiri High for like 4 years, and then went to Dio for my last 2 years of schooling, and the differences that I noticed were smaller class sizes for private. So the student to teacher ratio is typically lower. There's more opportunity to take part in a wide range of co-curricular activities. So just, you know, the access to the sports and things at Kirikiri, you can't do sports like rowing, and you can do that at Dio because it's a big sport. And then I moved down for netball because there's more opportunity, and the like just the competitiveness is bigger. So so I think it also depends on like the location of where the school is as well. I put here quality teaching staff ? And I don't want any teachers listening to get angry at this. But my thinking was, ultimately, like you get paid more if you're at
it's a face value assumption. A private school has more money to get better resources, and one of those resources is staff.
And to compete for potentially.
If it was like for like, potentially
not the case. Exactly. Not that that's also what the profession is entirely about, but anyway. Additional curriculum offered. So I also moved from doing NCEA at Kirikiri High to doing International Baccalaureate at Dio. So that was a big draw card, because that has recognition overseas and that kind of thing.
And
so
sometimes
there's also
greater range of like subjects at private schools.
Yes, exactly. I could study French. Can't do that at Kirikiri High. And then I put another pro as network. So a typical, like it's just who potential schools or networks and people that go there can open you up to in terms of opportunity. I also put here it can also be a thing for parents, because I was reading this Reddit thread that noted that was like a real benefit for someone.
Networking opportunities from knowing other parents at your highbrow private school.
Yeah, exactly.
Fancy.
Well, actually funny, talking to someone in the team at work, he was saying that he purposely goes to his daughter's netball games on the weekend, because he knows that someone from Air New Zealand is like the parent of so-and-so's kid that he can then network with. I was like, okay.
For a work-related reason.
And he's like, I'm going to use my kid as the in.
Love that.
So I thought that was kind of funny. But any other pros that you think for private?
No, I think you probably covered them all. Oh, the only other one I would add is it's potentially more beneficial for children that have like particular education needs. And so I think that's often why some parents feel a little bit stuck of like rock and a hard place in looking for private, as if they've identified that their child has particular like learning requirements and they're zoned for a public school that they just realize, is not going to meet that child's needs, or that child starts at public and then they're like, this is not working out. And then they tend to look at that. So you definitely have the opportunity to get that more hands-on teaching for children that need that. But of course that comes with, the additional cost.
Yeah, for sure.
Yep.
And what about the cons for private?
Cons. I mean, so we've obviously talked about financial cons. I think the other cons is potentially just all the kind of like peripheral stuff in terms of, well, what we've already talked about, like the psychology and pressure potentially placed on your child can be a lot higher than that of public school, particularly if there's an underlying sentiment in the family around the fact that this is costing a lot of money, or the parents are picking up that this is like a financial stressor for their parents. One con could be if your child is a boarder or has to be a boarder to access that and therefore is away from you for certain periods of time. Just the strictness of like uniforms, rules, all that kind of stuff. Like the education piece can be part of it, but all of that piece also sometimes doesn't work for certain kids.
Yeah, for sure.
And then really what we talked about before in terms of like what else does this restrict you from doing with your family? So, you know, is it a case of like, if you're going to go down the private school path, do you really need to like throw yourself into the community as a whole family to really garner all of the value and benefit, as you said, like the parents networking, the kids networking, the sports opportunities, all that kind of stuff? Are you really, really going to be a part of that? Or are you just there purely for like the education, go to school, do the learning,
get in, get out,
get home kind of thing? I was definitely that kid at private school because
get in and get out.
Get in, get out. Yeah. Also because, well, I guess the other thing that we haven't mentioned here is obviously for a public school, because it's based on zoning, you're typically closer to home, right? And so as a child, that can work really well for you. When you're private school, you're potentially, or I'd say more often than not, needing to travel via bus or public transport and that kind of stuff, and like the long days. And so that for me as a kid was a real driver to not be super involved in like extracurricular.
Don't commit to anything.
Yeah, I really didn't, because the commute from our house to the school that I went to was 45 minutes each way on the train. And I mostly did that by myself. There were other kids that would go for like half the journey with me that went to other private schools. But when I first started, I was the only child from my suburb that went to the school that I went to.
Oh, wow.
So I was literally pretty much going there by myself. And I was like, I don't want to do that at like 6 a.m. to get to, you know, a preschool sporting thing. And I also really wanted to keep all of my friends that I had met in my, like from my primary school, and all the activities that I did where we grew up in the suburb that we grew up. And so in order to do that, I needed to like continue doing those activities, not do sport, like school-based sports activities.
So it's more like club stuff.
Exactly. Exactly. Club-based stuff.
It's funny because I think about like, I boarded at Dyer for 2 years. And so like, I was complete opposite because I live on the campus. I'm like, commit to all the early morning things, do all the stuff.
Which you would if you're a boarder.
Exactly. Yes. And it was always the running joke that I had the shortest commute because it was like a 2-minute walk. Exactly. But I do also know that, again, was reading on Reddit, a lot of rural families, like the point about smaller class sizes being a pro, what they say in a lot of regional schools is that actually the wealthier families, and particularly farming families, send their kids to boarding school. So then the actual local schools, the class sizes are a bit smaller, because it means that, so that kind of like feeds into both of those in terms of like proximity, but then also like there's so many different factors that can like influence the pros and the cons, basically.
Exactly. So with that all in mind, I mean, what are we going to do? Who knows? I mean, if there is one thing that this whole episode has really taught me, it's the fact that I can completely understand why buying a larger house in my street in Mount Eden versus other streets in Mount Eden is like $1 million price point difference. Because we are very luckily in a 4 grammar zone, like little niche golden triangle, which is awesome. And I think it gives us a lot of flexibility and comfort. But we also talk a lot about like private school in general, and I don't know, I'm just personally like very on the fence about the cost and I guess the total stress that would be put on our household in order to achieve that. So I'm certainly not in the camp of like setting money aside regularly in order to save for that, but I'm possibly in the camp of like, we'll just see as we get closer to the time, and if we determine that private school is definitely something that we need to do. We'll just have to suck up making the lifestyle change and I guess prioritize like cash flow for that. But right now the current plan is public school all the way.
Nice. Love that.
Yeah.
I also have share a very similar view because I had the experience of both. I think there is like I don't really know if going to private school means that your kid is more likely to be quote unquote successful or like a better well-rounded human, or like, you know, yes, there's a lot of opportunity and stuff that comes from it, but arguably I look at my sister and Caroline did full public and I did the mix, and I'm like, yeah, Caroline's on paper like pretty well-rounded person and she's technically more on paper successful. So I'm like, does it really impact that?
Yeah,
you know. And it's funny,
there's so many factors that do, right? So
totally, it's like social circles, it's
as linear as
what
just
home life is like,
exactly,
you know, all that kind of stuff.
Your overall temperament, you as an individual,
your
motivation,
values,
all that type of stuff. So yeah, and you can always change, and I think like you're a good example of that, where it's like you don't need to commit all or nothing, you know. And once you've, let's say you do start private school at year 9 and then that's not working for your child, like they can leave and go to public. They'll be, you know, or vice versa.
Exactly.
And we have a friend at work who has also done that for her daughter, where she started intermediate private and actually didn't really like it and wasn't working, so moved back to public for the rest of senior. So
love that.
You know, it's like you can change. It's all good.
Yeah, exactly. Ollie and I also often talk about, to the point that you made earlier, what if we took that money and what else can we do with it? Because we would rather be able to put it or give them like, you know, a significant head start at the point at which they were old enough to like manage that money successfully, or like
consider paying for later education, which will potentially more determine their actual like career trajectory in life. So whether that be like going overseas to study or being able to have like paid study or not have a student loan or whatever it might be.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so
each
to their own, but here are the costs.
Great chat. Love that. Would love to hear from any parents that are either in the situation or pre this situation, currently deciding, all those sorts of things. There's no right or wrong, as Christine said, but really good thing to think about if you do have a child and this is in your future.
Yes. So at It's No Secret NZ on Instagram if you want to share your thoughts. Otherwise, we'll see you next week.
Bye.
Bye.